Is this the worst peace deal ever written down? No, but it may be the silliest, and it definitely reads like amateurs put it together. Yes, Axios has leaked the full 28-point peace plan recently crafted by U.S. and Russian mediators, with Steve Witkoff, a real estate developer with no diplomatic experience before 2025, heading up the task on the U.S. end. Witkoff had previously been accused of having no idea what he is doing, and let's just say that the 28 leaked points are not helping his cause. So, what we are going to do today is a little different than usual. I will start with just a few more background comments on where things stand in the war. Think of this as prerequisite overview information to better understand where the deal falls apart. Then we will go through the entire document, point by point, to see where its faults lie. And I think that it is worth stressing that not every point in it is as ridiculous as some of the online commentary has made it out to be. Nevertheless, as a whole, it is unworkable. Okay, the background. As compared to the Biden administration, we all know that Trump has taken a hands-off approach to the war, curtailing direct U.S. aid to Ukraine in favor of the Pearl Initiative, in which NATO partners pay for U.S. equipment, and the United States prioritizes those shipments, essentially allowing Europe and Ukraine to jump the line. Now, there was a ton of concern in Europe at the beginning of the year that the United States taking a step back would be disastrous for Ukraine. However, that has not been the case. Russia is still creeping forward, yes, and there are concerns that Pokrovsk will fold in the next few weeks. But the situation is not dire for Ukraine. All of this is to say that the United States does not have much bargaining leverage to coerce Ukraine into a deal that Kyiv does not want. It is true that the Trump administration is reportedly threatening to terminate the Pearl Initiative, but I think there is good reason to be skeptical either of the report or the sincerity of that threat. Again, this is European money purchasing U.S. materiel. Trump would effectively be refusing a whole lot of business if he were to end the initiative. This is a direct benefit to the United States, not a cost. So if the status quo persists, this is the relative pace that Ukraine can expect absent a deal. The main point here is that if the deal is a bad one, which it is, then Ukraine can just say no, and the world will still continue to revolve around the sun. Indeed, right after the leak, Zelensky tried to get out in front with the narrative, releasing the video that you are now watching. No, he said, Ukraine will not participate in this agreement. It is a bad one. Actually, the only real leverage that the United States has with Ukraine is on intelligence sharing, which has been a major contributor to the war. This is the latest timeline of Ukraine's oil and gas campaign. The United States has assisted here by providing information on where Russian air defenses are sitting at any given time, allowing Ukraine to evade them and strike valuable targets. This is important for cutting the Kremlin's revenues, which have an indirect effect on battlefield pressure. The less money that the Kremlin has, the fewer soldiers that it can send to the front lines. Unlike the Pearl aid, the United States could actually cut this, much like what happened after the Oval Office meltdown back in February. At the same time, though, the U.S. intelligence community benefits from getting practice here, at a relatively low marginal cost. As such, it is also unclear whether the United States would want to end this intelligence sharing, even if Ukraine is dead set on continuing the war. The other thing that I feel compelled to point out is that the words that are physically on this kind of document are irrelevant. What matters is whether there will be any follow-through when push comes to shove. If the words are consistent with expected actions, then fine. If not, then there is no point in writing those words at all. Actually, one more point. What you will see in a moment is that the document reads like it was written by a bunch of amateurs. It is not only bad in terms of content, but also in terms of construction. As a result, I would not immediately draw the conclusion that this is the official policy of the Trump administration. Maybe it is. Maybe it is Russia's version of what it thinks that Trump will find to be a reasonable deal. Maybe it was serious, but all of the media backlash will cancel that plan. For now, we might all benefit from taking a deep breath. Okay, with that as the background, let's get to the document. What I'm going to do now is read to you each point, and then provide my unscripted commentary about how it plays into the larger strategic environment. We are going to be here for a while, and there is not much visually important, so I would highly recommend that you get comfortable, or maybe start doing the dishes, go for a walk, take your dog to the park, whatever. Point 1. Ukraine's sovereignty will be confirmed. Well, at least we're starting pithy, because this is going to get a lot longer as we go. 2 things worth noting here. 1, this is not consistent with the rest of the document, so that's a problem in and of itself. And 2, I think it's worth looking at this and realizing that this is written in passive voice. Ukraine's sovereignty will be confirmed. Who is doing the confirmation there? Remember that this was written by U.S. and Russian diplomats. And you can think about a situation where maybe the diplomats from Russia are sitting there thinking to themselves, well, at some level, this thing needs to be said. This is going to be the foundational point of the entire document, as it were. But we don't want to be in a situation where we're telling the Kremlin that the Kremlin has to do that. We as Russian diplomats might be punished if we are forcing the Kremlin to say something like that. And so we have a point where it's just vague. Ukraine's sovereignty will be confirmed. Okay, cool. Point 2. A comprehensive non-aggression agreement will be concluded between Russia, Ukraine, and Europe. All ambiguities of the last 30 years will be considered settled. For those of you who have turned off your monitors, when I said Russia, Ukraine, and Europe, there was no Oxford comma there. And while the absence of an Oxford comma is not the worst part of this document, it does rank relatively high. Jokes aside, it is interesting that you have a document that was crafted again by US and Russian diplomats. And here, in just the second point, we're talking about how the final comprehensive agreement has to involve Russia, Ukraine, and Europe. Ukraine and Europe were not a part of the initial document. That's weird and inconsistent. But switching over to the social scientist hat that I sometimes wear as a self-respecting academic, it is true that, by and large, there is a long gap that takes place between when you have an initial ceasefire agreement like this one and when you have the final deal. And that raises some additional problems. That gap can range from months to even years. And because this is international relations, everything is subject to renegotiation if someone wants to renegotiate and has the coercive military or political power to force the terms to change. So keep that in mind as well as we keep going through this document. Point 3. It is expected that Russia will not invade neighboring countries and NATO will not expand further. Again, with the passive voice. Yikes. But, this is where the alarm bells started to go off for me, that this document was not carefully crafted on the US end in a way that is going to work for Europe, never mind Ukraine. And I am not talking about the underlying meaning of this point, nor am I referencing the passive voice part. Rather, there is something subtle about a particular word in this point. Let me read it again in case you are not actually looking at the screen. It is expected that Russia will not invade neighboring countries and NATO will not expand further. Do you see where the issue is? Did you hear the word that I just emphasized? When NATO talks about having new countries join the alliance, they do not refer to it as expansion. They refer to it as enlargement. And while we could debate the relevance of that particular word choice, does it really matter if we call it enlargement versus expansion? The fact that it says expand here means that this was not reviewed by anyone in Europe, and it was not reviewed by any US diplomats that actually understand how NATO works as an organization and how it projects itself on the international stage. So, to me, to borrow some poker lingo, that's a tell. It is something that the United States did not intend to actually have any sort of real meaning, but nonetheless, because they weren't aware of it, went ahead and put it in there. It would not surprise me if the Russian delegation knew that there was a difference between expand and enlarge, and deliberately tried to have the word expand appear there. I guess to them, expansion sounds like NATO is being threatening to Russia, whereas enlargement sounds a little bit more neutral. Either way, I don't think it is worth belaboring that particular point, the difference between expansion and enlargement. At the end of the day, more countries still want to join NATO, and NATO is in the business of protecting countries that want to be protected. But it is a sign of things to come, that there is a lack of consideration and forethought into what is necessary from Europe's perspective to get any of this to work. Point 4. A dialogue will be held between Russia and NATO, mediated by the United States, to resolve all security issues and create conditions for de-escalation in order to ensure global security and increase opportunities for cooperation and future economic development. Content-wise, this point is meaningless, but I do think that it is interesting that in a peace deal between Ukraine and Russia, Ukraine is already out of the picture on point 4 of the deal. I also find it humorous that there is going to be a mediation between Russia and NATO, with the United States serving as the mediator, except, wait, the United States is a part of NATO. Point 5. Ukraine will receive reliable security guarantees. Okay, would you like to expand on that a little bit? Well, the Axios article that leaked the rest of this peace plan came with a note on this particular point. Quote, a U.S. official told Axios this would be an explicit security guarantee for Ukraine from the U.S., the first time that has officially been on the table during these talks, though the proposal does not offer further details on what it entails. Great, so that's basically worthless. A recurring point that I have discussed so many times over the last, 11 months now, is that in order for a security guarantee to actually work, you have to be able to guarantee the security, which means that when push comes to shove, you will actually intervene in the conflict. Nothing that the United States has done in 2025 has instilled confidence in that. And truth be told, if you go back to the Biden administration, not much that the Biden administration was doing would suggest that the Biden administration would have intervened when push came to shove either. But if you want to stick to just the present, go to Europe. Europe's not doing too much to instill confidence there either. Europe is playing things relatively safe, and if you are actually going to intervene when push comes to shove, you are going to have to assume risk. And everything that Europe has done, not only this year, but previously as well, is to hedge away from that risk. In other words, signaling to Russia that Europe is not interested in taking those risks. So why is Russia going to believe that in the future, after a peace deal has been made, suddenly Europe is now going to be in the business of assuming risk? And I think that there are two layers to this problem. One is the straightforward policy issue for Ukraine, the absence of a security guarantee as we have been focusing on so far. The other is a little bit more subtle. This document is going to treat a lot of those security guarantees as being credible. And it's not just a problem with this document, because a lot of the discussions over in Europe, aside from this document, are also framed in the same way. And that is a deeper problem. If you are treating things like they are credible when they are not, then you are planning for things that you're not actually going to be following through on. And everything that is contained in the rest of this document, and everything that goes on in the rest of the diplomatic affairs, is effectively worthless. Point 6. The size of the Ukrainian armed forces will be limited to 600,000 personnel. There has been a lot of media and online discussion about this particular point, because it seems like it is going to severely constrain Ukraine in the future, and that will be a problem. You already know this from basic lines on maps theory. If you are going to have a settlement that ends a crisis, then the terms of the settlement have to be roughly commensurate with the balance of power between the two sides, what each side expects to get if they fight a war. So if you place a limitation on what one party is capable of doing militarily, then the opponent is going to be able to exploit that in the future. And it certainly seems like this is the case here with having a 600,000 person cap on Ukraine's military. Well, we are going to see a significant problem along those lines later on, but the 600,000 person part is not really all that problematic. Ukraine has about 800 to 850,000 personnel currently fighting the war. And when the war comes to an end, a ceasefire is imposed, and then you have a longer-term deal put into place, Ukraine is not going to be mobilizing at that level continuously in the future. To give you an idea of what the baseline looks like here, before the full-scale invasion in 2022, Ukraine had about 250,000 active personnel. So the post-settlement number for Ukraine, absent any actual constraint, is going to be between 250,000 and 800,000. And 600,000 is not actually all that different from what you might expect. It is also worth noting that when you have limitations imposed like this, it is relatively easy to work around them. You can go back and read about the Weimar Republic after World War I ended. Germany was supposed to demilitarize, but Germany found quite a good number of creative ways of working around that system. What do you mean that's a soldier? That's just a policeman. He's heavily armed, but pay no attention to that part. He's police. He's not a member of the armed forces. And to be clear, I am talking about well before the Nazis even came into the picture. And don't you worry, we will get back to the Nazis later. Now, even those sorts of absurdities aside, the fact that you can work around that sort of thing means that trying to impose this in the first place is kind of silly. And regardless, this is the type of thing that Ukraine should strike from the record anyway. Point 7. Ukraine agrees to enshrine in its constitution that it will not join NATO, and NATO agrees to include in its statutes a provision that Ukraine will not be admitted in the future. I think that this is another tell. I think that this is the type of thing that you can only write if you don't understand the broader political considerations that surround this situation. And that's for both Ukraine and NATO. On the Ukrainian side of things, do you really think that voters in Ukraine would approve an amendment to the Constitution that says that Ukraine is not going to join NATO? No, that's not going to happen. Well, what about NATO? NATO doesn't have voters, at least not directly. Should be easier to go through NATO, right? No, again, do you know how NATO works? For NATO to do something like that, there has to be consensus among all 32 members of NATO to formally strike Ukraine from being eligible for NATO membership. Do you think Estonia is going to go along with that? Do you think Latvia is going to go along with that? How about Lithuania? Poland? How about Finland? All 5 of those countries, as well as the other 27, would all have to consent to this. Perhaps Russia can take some solace in the fact that it works both ways, and you would have to have all 32 members agree to having Ukraine join for Ukraine to become a member of NATO. And at various different points, you have countries like Hungary, Turkey, the United States, the United Kingdom, all expressing reservations with that. Either way, take your pick. This point is a non-starter, or it is never going to work in practice, and therefore it could be excluded from this document, or included from this document. It wouldn't matter because it's not going to actually do anything. Point 8. NATO agrees not to station troops in Ukraine. And once more, a lack of clarity in language here makes me think that whoever wrote this particular point doesn't really understand the politics of the situation. If you take this point literally, it is completely meaningless. NATO agrees not to station troops in Ukraine. Well, NATO doesn't really have a set of armed forces. NATO has member countries, and each of those members has its own individual armed forces, and they might collectively work together to decide what they are going to do and where they are going to deploy, but there aren't people in NATO uniforms running around on a battlefield. Now, maybe what it means is that NATO members agree not to station troops in Ukraine. But if that is the case, then that is what should be written in this document, not NATO agrees to not station troops in Ukraine. Of course, even fixing that doesn't solve the overall problem, because there are a bunch of countries in what they call the coalition of the willing who are at least discussing this and would not be okay with removing that as a possibility. But aside from that, going back to my earlier point about the United States and Europe not being able to establish credible security guarantees, this works against that point. One of the ways that you can establish credibility is by having some of your troops sitting on the front lines so that, for example, if Russia were to restart hostilities, some of those troops would be killed, and then there would be furor inside of Europe or the United States or wherever, causing those governments to send more troops to fight back against Russia. This just gets rid of that possibility. And so you are undermining the credibility of interventions, even though the rest of the document assumes the credibility of those interventions to be the case. Point 9. European fighter jets will be stationed in Poland. I have no idea what this is supposed to be doing. European fighter jets are stationed in Poland right now. This is just like you found a cool fact on the internet and you wanted to write it down in a peace document. I have no idea what this is doing here, and there's no context behind it either. Is it supposed to be saying that European fighter jets are going to be providing security to Ukraine and not U.S. fighter jets? And if so, then why doesn't it just say that? Why don't you say U.S. fighter jets will not be stationed in Poland? And you know what? Just to add to the irony of the situation, more of them have been sent over in that direction as a consequence of the war, and specifically recently with Russia's apparent inability to keep its own drones inside of Ukrainian airspace. That has forced NATO to deploy its Eastern Sentry initiative to have more troops, more forces, more radars, more all sorts of materiel stationed in Poland to be able to handle that problem. But, this is just the most absurd thing, so I think we really should move on. Point 10, and here is the part of the document where we start having to do a lot of reading. The U.S. guarantee. 1. The U.S. will receive compensation for the guarantee. 2. If Ukraine invades Russia, it will lose the guarantee. 3. If Russia invades Ukraine, in addition to a decisive coordinated military response, all global sanctions will be reinstated. Recognition of the new territory and all other benefits of this deal will be revoked. 4. If Ukraine launches a missile at Moscow or St. Petersburg without cause, the security guarantee will be deemed invalid. I like how everything that is not Moscow or St. Petersburg inside of Russia gets sold out here. But I want to draw your attention to the top. For the guarantee. We'll lose the guarantee. Okay, not exactly reassuring that the first two of these points do not actually describe what the guarantee is. You don't really get into the guarantee until point 3, and point 4 is a condition of the guarantee. So we only have the U.S. guarantee being explored in one of those subpoints. And even within subpoint 3, we don't really get a very good understanding of what this guarantee is. A decisive coordinated military response, global sanctions being reinstated, recognition of everything that's going on with the rest of this deal being revoked. Okay, well, part of this, as well as part 4 on the Ukrainian side, is just a standard sort of conditional guarantee that we're not going to be providing you with a blank check. Both sides, Ukraine and Russia, actually have to abide by the deal, otherwise the terms of the deal are void. But what exactly is this decisive coordinated military response? How is that going to be credible? If Europe and the United States are not actually willing to do that now, why are they going to be willing to do that in the future? And moreover, how are they going to do this if no NATO troops are in the country? And by NATO troops, again, I mean the member states of NATO having troops deployed to the country. I also have a bunch of question marks on how you're going to enforce the conditionality of this. You know that the way that this is going to eventually get broken to some degree, at least in spirit, if not in actual practice of one of the parties recognizing that this has been in breach and then taking the effective actions thereafter. You know that the way that this is going to be broken is through covert Russian action, and that's going to happen almost immediately after the deal has been signed. Ukraine, of course, is going to want to take countermeasures, and so you end up in active hostilities with both sides pointing fingers at each other about who was initially responsible. And while for some of us it may be clear who was initially responsible, the way that that is going to be discussed in the broader political context is going to be a murky mess, and you're not going to necessarily have consensus in Europe or the United States or elsewhere about it, and that is going to undermine who is going to be punished for having violated the deal. Last thing to say here, subpoint 1, the U.S. will receive compensation for the guarantee. What exactly is the United States doing that warrants the compensation for the guarantee? I don't see actions that the United States is taking right now that should result in compensation for doing anything. I'm also very baffled why that would be the first subpoint here. That seems like it should be the last subpoint of a much larger section on what a U.S. guarantee would look like, because we're not actually getting very good details on what that U.S. guarantee would look like. Or it would be in a separate section altogether. And there are going to be some discussions later on that might look like that, but I don't know why that's written here. It shouldn't be written here. It's kind of silly. Point 11. Ukraine is eligible for EU membership and will receive short-term preferential access to the European market while this issue is being considered. A couple of things to say about what is directly written here, and then some commentary on what others think that this is ultimately implying. For one thing, Ukraine has always been eligible for EU membership. That's already the case. Ukraine could eventually join the EU. Obviously, the EU and Ukraine are negotiating on this, but that doesn't change because of this document. As for the part about receiving short-term preferential access to the European market, one of the stumbling blocks for Ukraine joining the European Union is the fact that Ukraine is what has previously been described as the breadbasket of Europe, and that is concerning to a lot of European farmers. If you think about some of the conflict that has taken place between Poland and Ukraine during the war, I'm not talking about military conflict between Ukraine and Poland, but political conflict. A lot of that has been based in Polish farmers upset about Ukrainian exports coming into Europe. And given how the rest of this document is being so poorly received in Europe, I don't think that those Polish farmers are going to think to themselves, wow, what a steal of a deal the rest of this is. Let's put aside our issues with Ukrainian exports and allow the rest of this to go through. The thing that is not explicitly here, but has nonetheless been discussed online, is the notion that the European Union is in fact the big important thing for Ukraine. Forget about NATO. It's all about the European Union, because, after all, the European Union, in its foundational documents, has even stronger security guarantees written into it. So forget about NATO, forget about Article 5, the EU is where it's at. I could go on a 30-minute rant about this, so I'm going to have to restrain myself here. But the short version is, my goodness, is that an absurd take. The EU is an economic bloc. The EU has a military wing. It's called NATO. And I know that the membership of the European Union and NATO are not one-to-one. There are some members in the European Union who are not in NATO, and there are some members of NATO that are not in the European Union. I understand that. But the way that the Western security atmosphere has been constructed, especially in regard to Europe, is that the European Union handles the trade affairs and NATO handles the military affairs. So a security guarantee that is written into an economic bloc is basically meaningless. I do not care if the European Union's security guarantees, as they are written down, use stronger language than what NATO's security guarantees look like. That is completely irrelevant, again, because what is written down in a treaty doesn't actually matter. What matters is what people will do when push comes to shove. Let me ask you this. What is the article number of the European Union Security Guarantee? Do you know it off the top of your head? Probably not. Do you know the article number of the NATO Security Guarantee? Of course you do. It's Article 5. That is something that anyone in security policy is well aware of. And there's a reason for that. It's because people care about Article 5. They do not care about Article 42.7. By the way, yes, the European Union Security Guarantee is a subpoint. It's not the actual point, it is a subpoint. No one is going to be running to the defense of a European country because of an obscure subprovision that even people deeply involved in security affairs often have to look up the number of. That is not a security guarantee. Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty is a security guarantee. So would Ukraine like to join the European Union? Yes. Would having greater economic integration between Ukraine and the rest of the European Union give the European Union more reason to intervene in Ukrainian security affairs when it becomes necessary? Also true. Is the European Union actually going to be able to provide security guarantees in and of itself? No, that's not what it's for. We need to move on. More reading. Point 12. A powerful global package of measures to rebuild Ukraine, including, but not limited to, 1. The creation of a Ukraine Development Fund to invest in fast-growing industries, including technology, data centers, and artificial intelligence. 2. The United States will cooperate with Ukraine to jointly rebuild, develop, modernize, and operate Ukraine's gas infrastructure, including pipelines and storage facilities. 3. Joint efforts to rehabilitate war-affected areas for the restoration, reconstruction, and modernization of cities and residential areas. 4. Infrastructure development. 5. Extraction of minerals and natural resources. 6. The World Bank will develop a special financing package to accelerate these efforts, and they better make sure that it is a special financing package and not a special military operation. Those two things should never meet. This is all some pretty basic stuff that will be a part of whatever peace deal is ultimately agreed to, and it basically has nothing to do with the peace deal itself. This is the type of thing that the Western coalition broadly, including the United States, is going to have to do. They're going to have to reinvest in Ukraine to make sure that Ukraine is not economically weak, because a very poor Ukraine is not going to be very good at defending itself. Also, and tracing back to the previous point and other points before that, if you actually want to have the Western coalition, the United States and Europe, have credible threats to intervene on behalf of Ukraine in the event that a war restarts, then you're going to have to work on that sort of economic integration. Point 13. Russia will be reintegrated into the global economy. 1. The lifting of sanctions will be discussed and agreed upon in stages, and on a case-by-case basis. 2. The United States will enter into a long-term economic cooperation agreement for mutual development in the areas of energy, natural resources, infrastructure, artificial intelligence, data centers, rare earth metal extraction projects in the Arctic, and other mutually beneficial corporate opportunities. 3. Russia will be invited to rejoin the G8. Overlooking the triumphant return of the Oxford comma, this is not saying too much up until point 3. Part of this is based on what's actually written in points 1 and 2, and part of it is what's going to happen in practice. In order for point 2 to actually come into effect, you have to start lifting sanctions. And if you're going to be lifting sanctions, well, according to this, that's something that's going to be discussed after the fact, not right now. The big issue, even if you've removed economic sanctions, is that you would actually need U.S. firms to want to go into Russia. And that is a tough ask. We have seen Russia do some sketchy things in Europe. That is probably going to continue on some level. How bad it's going to be in the future is an interesting question. But that means that any firm that's investing in Russia has to worry that one day, snap of the fingers, all of that investment is going to be for nothing. The relationship between the United States and Russia will terminate, and afterward, Russia may even nationalize the assets that you've invested in. Now, you may think to yourself, well, Trump is there, and presumably Trump is going to figure out ways to make sure that that isn't an issue. But Trump is not going to be around forever, and if you look 3 years into the future, the type of the time horizon that these sorts of companies are going to be thinking about primarily, who knows what the U.S. political situation is going to look like. And so even if you're not that concerned about what's happening with Russia, you still have to be concerned that the United States might start to terminate those agreements as well. All of that is telling businesses, hey, maybe it's not such a great idea to do any of these sorts of tasks. Last point about the G8. The reason that Russia was kicked out of the G8 was not the 2022 invasion. It was what happened in 2014, the Crimean crisis, and also what followed in the Donbass. Even if you get the war resolved, that does not eliminate the underlying ideological conflict between Russia and the remaining members of what was previously the G8, now the G7. All of that will still be there, and so it's not sensible for Russia to be rejoining the G8. The G8 will not be effective or functional if Russia is there. Point 14. Frozen funds will be used as follows. 1. $100 billion in frozen Russian assets will be invested in U.S.-led efforts to rebuild and invest in Ukraine. 2. The U.S. will receive 50% of the profits from this venture. Europe will add $100 billion to increase the amount of investment available for Ukraine's reconstruction. Frozen European funds will be unfrozen. The remainder of the frozen Russian funds will be invested in a separate U.S.-Russian investment project vehicle that will implement joint projects in specific areas. This fund will be aimed at strengthening relations and increasing common interests to create a strong incentive to not return to conflict. 2 quick points about this. 1. The U.S. share here may be a necessary evil eventually. I don't think that this agreement is going to be workable for a lot of reasons, obviously. But don't be surprised if you see something like this in the future. Again, in part because Ukraine is going to feel a need to try to keep the United States interested in Ukrainian affairs. The second bit about U.S. cooperation with Russia, might want to look back at what happened with German cooperation with Russia in the intervening years between 2014 and 2022, as well as to some degree what happened before 2014. That did not work out so well, and so I'm not sure why you would want to be optimistic about this case being any different. Point 15. A joint American-Russian working group on security issues will be established to promote and ensure compliance with all provisions of this agreement. Other than asking where Europe and Ukraine are in this particular point, something like this will be created with any peace deal that is ultimately implemented. Not much more to add there. Point 16. Russia will enshrine in law its policy of non-aggression toward Europe and Ukraine. Well, that's reassuring. Russia is going to have a law that says there will not be aggression against Europe and Ukraine. Here's the thing. If you live in an autocracy, the leader has lots of power. Laws don't really matter in autocracies if the leader doesn't want to actually follow through on the law, because the leader can just change the law. This is not a democratic sort of world where if you want to change a law, you might, inside of the United States, have to have a large coalition of a majority inside of the House, a supermajority inside of the Senate to get past the filibuster, and the president himself to actually want to change the policy. As such, this is a completely meaningless provision of the document. Point 17. The United States and Russia will agree to extend the validity of treaties on the non-proliferation and control of nuclear weapons, including the START I treaty. And boy howdy is this another tell. The START I treaty, guess when that expires? Oh, it actually expired all the way back in 2009. Presumably what they meant here is that there needs to be the extension of the New START treaty, which is set to expire in this upcoming February. That's only a few months away. But anyone who is involved in nuclear non-proliferation would realize that there was a fundamental mistake here, which again is telling us that whoever wrote this document didn't really know what was going on. And at least for this particular point, it would also mean that whoever was doing this over with the Russian delegation also was completely lost about the nuclear non-proliferation issues here. Point 18. Ukraine agrees to be a non-nuclear state in accordance with the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons. Nothing new here. Ukraine is already a member of the NPT. And while Ukraine definitely knows how to produce a nuclear weapon, it does not have any of the actual infrastructure to do that. Obviously, Ukraine has a ton of nuclear power plants on its soil, including one that we will get to in the next point. But there's a difference between nuclear power plants and nuclear weapons, and as it stands right now, Ukraine does not have the infrastructure to create the fuel for a nuclear weapon. And as a result, this provision of the document does not really add anything here. Point 19. The Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant will be launched under the supervision of the IAEA, and electricity produced will be distributed equally between Russia and Ukraine, 50-50. Interesting choice of words, launched. It's like the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant is going to space or something. I know that this is not going to be popular inside of Ukraine, but Russia has taken a step back in its demands here. From the Russian perspective, anything that Russia is physically capable of occupying is now Russian, and one of those things is the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, which again is still on the ground and not being launched into space, yet. So if Ukraine is getting something from the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, that's better than the baseline default expectation here, which would have been 0. And again, I know that might not sit well with Ukraine, and it's awful from a legal perspective, but that's not how international coercion works when you're thinking about military conquest. Moving on, and further validating Goodwin's Law, point 20. Both countries undertake to implement educational programs in schools and society aimed at promoting understanding and tolerance of different cultures and eliminating racism and prejudice. 1. Ukraine will adopt EU rules on religious tolerance and the protection of linguistic minorities. 2. Both countries will agree to abolish all discriminatory measures and guarantee the rights of Ukrainian and Russian media and education. 3. All Nazi ideology and activities must be rejected and prohibited. See, everything eventually becomes about Nazis. But you can understand why Russia really wanted to get this into the document. This is underscoring Russia's concerns at the beginning of the war, or at least the concerns that Russia was airing vocally at the beginning of the war to try to appeal to maybe a domestic or international audience. And it would be very fascinating indeed to see what exactly the measures that Russia would take inside of Russian territory to go along with this point. And you know what? There are some neo-Nazi groups inside of Ukraine. But I'm going to conclude this point by showing you the list of neo-Nazi groups inside of Russia. Finally, the meat of it. Point 21. Territories. 1. Crimea, Luhansk, and Donetsk will be recognized as de facto Russian, including by the United States. 2. Kherson and Zaporizhzhia will be frozen along the line of contact, which will mean de facto recognition along the line of contact. 3. Russia will relinquish other agreed territories and controls outside of the 5 regions. 4. Ukrainian forces will withdraw from the part of Donetsk Oblast that they currently control, and this withdrawal zone will be considered a neutral demilitarized buffer zone, internationally recognized as territory belonging to the Russian Federation. Russian forces will not enter this demilitarized zone. Okay, lots of things to go through here. As a starting point, what is de facto recognition? De facto means something that's actually happening in practice, but usually unrecognized. So that's a bit of an oxymoron there. De facto will almost certainly be true of any deal that ultimately ends this war, but the recognition part is not going to be universal, and certainly not within Ukraine and not within Europe. And the reason for that sort of de facto outcome is that, to change things, Ukraine actually needs to unstick Russia from those territories, which, at least as far as we can tell, is something that's not feasible. And even if there were to be a large surge in European funds and weapons going into Ukraine, it's doubtful that Ukraine is going to be able to meaningfully change what the status quo territorial control looks like. Thus, subpoint 2 about Kherson and Zaporizhzhia will likely be a part of whatever deal is ultimately crafted. And it is worth noting here that Russia has taken a step back from its previous demands. Again, not to say that this is a good document from Ukraine's perspective or Europe's perspective, or it's the type of document that's going to be implemented, but this does reflect a change in Russian demands. Previously, Russia had demanded all of Kherson and all of Zaporizhzhia, including substantial parts that Russia had not yet conquered, and with Kherson especially, parts of it that are across a river that Russia has shown no ability to be able to cross. Moreover, within Russian law, according to Russian Federation law, those parts of Kherson and Zaporizhzhia are a part of Russia. So Russia has moved back from that. And I think it's notable because there is a large collection of individuals inside of the West that absolutely insist that the reason the war continues is because if we had a settlement roughly equivalent to whatever the line of control looks like today, that Russia is going to be having some sort of massive domestic uprising, the Kremlin is going to have a bunch of turbulence, Putin is going to be overthrown, all because Russia said, the Kremlin said, that it would be able to get all of this territory and then was unable to follow through on it. And I do not want to belabor the point, because I've certainly talked about this a ton on the channel previously, but the real political issues for the Kremlin are not ending the war, roughly equivalent to what the line of control looks like. The real risk to the Kremlin is continuing the war, and this is further evidence of that. On point 3, Russia will relinquish other agreed territories it controls outside of the 5 regions. This is actually not that much of a concession. Russia has a little bit of territory going into Sumy, a little bit of territory going north to south into Kharkiv, and a little bit of territory going east to west, going out of Luhansk and into Kharkiv Oblast. It's something, but it's not much, and it certainly doesn't compensate for the problem that occurs in Part 4. Let me reread this because there's a little bit of subtlety here. It seems that Russia has changed what it actually is demanding, but there's a deeper strategic problem. Subpoint 4 says, Ukrainian forces will withdraw from the part of Donetsk Oblast that they currently control, and this withdrawal zone will be considered a neutral demilitarized buffer zone, internationally recognized as territory belonging to the Russian Federation. Russian forces will not enter this demilitarized zone. So, on the surface, this looks like a concession from Russia. Previously, the idea would be that the line of control would simply align with the Donetsk Oblast border. And this is saying it's going to be a little bit different. The territorial recognition will align with that border, but the actual division of how military troops are going to be placed is going to leave that area blank, what is between the current line of control and what is the border of Donetsk Oblast. But that completely overlooks the military problem. The military problem all along is that Ukraine's fortress belt resides between where the current front line is and where the boundary with Donetsk Oblast is. So if Ukraine withdraws from that area, even if Russian troops are not immediately occupying it, Ukraine has given up a lot of its physical control over that territory. And thus you have the central problem with negotiated settlements that we've been talking about for probably more than a year at this point. The settlement that you reach has to be commensurate with not only what the balance of power looks like right now, but what the balance of power would look like after the settlement is implemented. And if Ukraine retreats to the border of the Donetsk Oblast, even if you do not have the Russian troops immediately occupying the difference, it still puts Ukraine in a position where it is not as militarily powerful as before. A couple of months from now, after Ukraine has retreated, Russia can then occupy that section militarily, and Ukraine is not going to be able to resist Russia. And then once Russia gets up to that border with Donetsk, guess what? Russia can keep going. And that's the problem. That Ukraine cannot be confident that Russia is not going to push past that territory. And at least with the rest of this document, the way that this is supposed to be framed is that Ukraine is going to be reassured by security guarantees coming from the West. But given all of the holes that I have poked in this throughout the rest of this talk, yeah, that's not going to work very well for Ukraine, and that's why we have a central problem with this document still. It looks like on the surface that something has changed, but in practice, with the actual military strategy of the situation, it hasn't. Now, a skeptic might look at this and say, wait a minute, isn't there some balance here? Russia is also withdrawing from those other regions, and so that gives Ukraine a greater ability to attack further areas if Ukraine would want to. And while I have said just a moment ago that the amount of territory in Sumy and Kharkiv is relatively small compared to the amount of territory in Donetsk, even aside from that, the big difference is that Ukraine does not have offensive potential. And so Russia has not been taking over parts of Sumy and then building fortifications to defend those parts of Sumy, or Kharkiv either. Consequently, there are not the same sort of domino problems there are for Russia as there are for Ukraine, which is why this again is a non-starter ultimately. Point 22. After agreeing on future territorial agreements, both the Russian Federation and Ukraine undertake not to change these agreements by force. Any security guarantees will not apply in the event of a breach of this commitment. Well, that's meaningless for the reasons that we've talked about before. It's also retreading earlier ground, so let's not go into further depth here. Actually, no. You know what? One other interesting thing about point 22. It's like this time Russia actually means it. That's the philosophy. That's the attitude that's being taken here. Don't look at what's happened historically. Don't look at what Russia wants to do. This time, Russia means it. Don't worry about it. Point 23. Russia will not prevent Ukraine from using the Dnipro River for commercial activities, and agreements will be reached on the free transport of grain across the Black Sea. Again, this is common stuff that we would expect in any sort of agreement, but there's another tell here. Do you see it? They did not use the Ukrainian word for the river. It's the Dnipro River for Ukraine. Again, that's the type of thing that if anyone were actually paying attention on the European or American side about that sort of thing, or if you even consulted Europeans on this, that's the type of thing that would be fixed and changed in the actual document. Point 24. A humanitarian committee will be established to resolve outstanding issues. 1. All remaining prisoners and bodies will be exchanged on an all-for-all basis. 2. All civilian detainees and hostages will be returned, including children. 3. A family reunification program will be implemented. 4. Measures will be taken to alleviate the suffering of the victims of the conflict. Nothing too interesting here. Some of this already got restarted when Trump began mediating the conflict. The Kremlin viewed this as a way of trying to appease Trump to some degree while stalling out on any further concessions. The issue with children, though, is going to be a subpoint, because you can bet that there is going to be a bunch of Ukrainian children who are still lost, a lot of Ukrainian parents asking where their children went, and Russia simply shrugging their shoulders and saying, we don't really know. Point 25. Ukraine will hold elections in 100 days. Nothing interesting to report on here. Something like that is going to happen one way or another. The real intrigue will begin once that campaign season begins. Will Zelensky run for re-election? Will Valery Zaluzhny decide to declare his candidacy? If Zaluzhny runs, will Zelensky want to bow out? Who knows? Lots of political intrigue ahead. Point 26. All parties involved in this conflict will receive full amnesty for their actions during the war, and agree not to make any claims or consider any complaints in the future. Well, I guess all parties involved is doing some heavy lifting here. If you're excluding Europe from this, that presents a great problem for actually implementing this sort of provision. The International Criminal Court is not going to say, oh, wait a minute, there's a provision, point 26, that says everyone has amnesty. That's not how the International Criminal Court works. So those sorts of charges that have been levied against Putin and others inside of Russia are still going to be there. But this once more speaks to the sloppiness of the document. I don't know who all the parties are, and I don't understand how, if you thought that this actually includes individuals that are involved in the International Criminal Court, why you think that this would actually work in practice. Point 27. This agreement will be legally binding. Its implementation will be monitored and guaranteed by the Peace Council, headed by President Donald J. Trump. Sanctions will be imposed for violations. As always, I am obligated to remind you that nothing in international relations is legally binding in any meaningful way. Aside from that, this is not just a Donald J. Trump problem. This is a problem that is going to last years and decades, well after Trump has come and gone. Think about the Korean War. We still have a demilitarized zone there, even though that war ended in the 1950s. So you can say legally binding all you want. You can describe this as an issue for Donald Trump, but in practice, and certainly well into the future, neither one of those things is going to hold much weight. Point 28. Once all parties agree to this memorandum, the ceasefire will take effect immediately after both sides retreat to agreed points to begin implementation of the agreement. And thus begins the countdown that everyone around the world is going to be watching to see just how long it takes for Russia to start violating the deal. Now, just to give you my concluding thoughts here, this document is already getting battered in the media, and even within the Republican Party. We don't know who is leaking it. There is plenty of speculation that Russia has been involved. I don't know what's going on here, to be sure. We will see if this goes anywhere, but it is facing major uphill battles in Ukraine, Europe, and even within the United States, so don't necessarily bet on it. Meanwhile, you can always bet on quality educational content from these two books about the war. Check the video description for more information on them. And if you enjoyed today's video, then please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.